Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. David Hume begins his Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding in section 1 by drawing a distinction, which he's going to elaborate at length, between what we could call a popular kind of philosophy and a more technical kind of philosophy. The terms that he tends to use are easy and obvious, which comes up a little bit later in the text, and accurate and abstruse. And so what is the difference between these modes of philosophy? At the beginning, he says, moral philosophy, or the science of human nature, may be treated after two different manners. So it's in part how we're doing philosophy, how we're articulating it, each of which, he says, has its peculiar merit and may contribute to the entertainment, instruction, and reformation of mankind. So he's not saying one of them is good and one of them is bad, but they have different functions, different ranges, you could say. So he begins by talking about the easy and obvious. He says, the one considers man chiefly as born for action and influenced in his measures by taste and sentiment, pursuing one object and avoiding another according to the value which these objects seem to possess and according to the light in which they present themselves. So what are we getting here? A sort of, combination of ethics, psychology, considerations of how we ought to behave, some moral instruction, you could say. And he's going to talk about action. He's also going to use the word business here. He'll also use the word a little bit later, sociability. So this is an important side of ourselves, right? On the other side, we have a different kind of philosophy. He says, the other species of philosophers consider man in the light of a reasonable rather than active being and endeavor to form his understanding more than cultivate his manners. So they're both working on human nature, but they're going about it in importantly different ways, which will have different effects. So following this out, going back to the easy philosophy, we read, as virtue of all objects is allowed to be the most valuable, this species of philosophers paint her in the most amiable colors, borrowing all helps from poetry and eloquence and treating their subject in an easy and obvious manner, and such as is best fitted to appeal to or please the imagination and engage the affections. So, somewhat different language here than we're used to today. The affections or sentiments are actually the human emotions, right? And the force of the imagination in modern philosophy is often distinguished from the intellect or, a more abstract, abstruse way of understanding things. And so this is for everybody because everybody has emotions. Now, virtue is a term that was very widespread in Hume's time, indeed so widespread that it could mean just about anything to anyone, as a number of critics, including from that time, have pointed out. We don't talk so much about virtue and vice, but we talk about goodness and badness and being a decent person, being a scumbag. We have other language that we use for that. And a lot of what we do today is really philosophy, moral philosophy of this popular sort. we attempt to tell people to behave in good ways, ways that we think are good, and to avoid behaving in bad ways. We do this with children. We do this with young adults. We do this trying to, have public service announcements to steer people's sentimentality into the things that we want. And people do this from all different sides as well. So he says, how do they do this? They select the most striking observations and instances from common life, place opposite characters in a proper contrast, alluring us to the paths of virtue by the views of glory, happiness, direct our steps in these paths by precepts and examples. They make us feel the difference between vice and virtue. They excite and regulate our sentiments, and so they can but bend our hearts to the love of probity and true honor. They think they've fully attained the end of all their labors. Again, language that's a bit different than our own time. I remember when I was a kid, we used to get these highlights magazines for kids, and they had a comic strip called Goofus and Gallant. Gallant was the well-behaved, I think, teenager who does the right things. Goofus is kind of a slob and selfish and lazy, and, there's a direct contrast there. That's this kind of philosophy. It's not articulated as philosophy, but it still is moral philosophy, according to Hume. All right, so what happens when we get to the other more accurate philosophy? Well, it also looks at human nature. It regards human nature as a subject of speculation, and with a narrow scrutiny examines it in order to find principles which regulate our understanding, excite our sentiments, and which make us approve or blame any particular object, action, or behavior. So it's looking at things in a more rigorous way, you could say. And he goes on and he's talking about the need to have fixed beyond controversy the foundation of morals, reasoning, and criticism, talking about truth and falsehood, vice and virtue, beauty and deformity. And that, this side over here does that forever without being able to determine the source of these distinctions. They, on this side, proceed from particular instances to general principles. They push their inquiries to principles more general, and they rest not satisfied till they arrive at those original principles, the basic ones, right, which we can then organize into a system by which, in every science, all human curiosity must be bounded. So, what are they going to do in terms of effects? Well, the popular philosophy is, as you can guess, popular, right? He says that it's certain that the easy and obvious philosophy will always, with the generality of mankind, and this includes elites, right, have the preference above the accurate and abstruse, and by many will be recommended not only as more agreeable, enjoyable, right, but also as more useful. You can actually do something with this philosophy. He says it enters more into common life, molds the hearts and affections, by touching those principles which actuate men, reforms their conduct, and brings them nearer to that model of perfection which it describes. What about the more rigorous, accurate philosophy? Now, this is where it gets very interesting. So Hume is going to say, well, it doesn't really do that much. The abstruse philosophy, which being founded on a turn of mind which cannot enter into business and action, vanishes when the philosopher leaves the shade and comes into open day, nor can its principles easily retain influence over conduct and behavior. So he's going to say the feelings of our heart, agitation of our passions, vehemence of our affections dissipate all its conclusions. This is more intellectual, more cognitive. This is more affective. And for Hume, the affects are going to win out over cognitions. Now, what's really interesting about this is that Hume isn't saying, well, you got two kinds of people. People of passion, people of reflection or intellect. He's actually saying the philosopher who engages in accurate and abstruse philosophy, which includes David Hume himself, when they step outside of their study into his proverbial billiards room or out of the shade into the sun, then all of this kind of goes away. It's a very academic study, not in the sense of having classes or such, but it's something that you do on your own as a theoretical enterprise. And so, it kind of makes sense that would be the case. He also has another really interesting feature that I would like to point out here. And he begins by saying that the most durable and justest fame has been acquired by the easy philosophy, and abstract reasoners seem to have enjoyed only a momentary reputation, but they have not been able to support their renown with more equitable posterity. Why? Well, this is where he talks about mistakes. So he says, it's easy for a profound philosopher to commit a mistake in his subtle reasonings. And one mistake is the parent of another. Now, that could apply over here to the easy philosopher as well, couldn't it? Yeah, it could. But what calls the mistakes into question? In the case of the easy philosopher who goes astray, common sense and the general or natural sentiments of humankind will check them and eventually bring them back into the fold, so to speak. So they can make mistakes. They also make lots of mistakes. But those mistakes aren't really going to catch on so easy, and they kind of bounce back from it. With the abstract philosopher, when they make mistakes, there's nothing else other than maybe another abstract philosopher to say, hey man, you're screwing up. So he says one mistake is the necessary parent of another, while he pushes on his consequences and is not deterred from embracing any conclusion by its unusual appearance or its contradiction to popular opinion. So if popular opinion says, yeah, there aren't any Platonic forms, a Platonist can say, well, you think that because you're a dummy. You're an ordinary person. You're part of the mob, right? You obviously don't get it. Popular opinion contradicting the abstruse philosopher might actually be taken by the abstruse philosopher as a sign that they're on the right track. And so mistakes can kind of snowball and get much larger. So he's going to say something really kind of funny here, especially if we consider this from our own temporal perspective. This is in the 18th century. So he says, the fame of Cicero flourishes at present, but that of Aristotle is utterly decayed. 19th century, it would go the opposite. Cicero and the other Hellenistic or imperial Roman philosophers go down, except for Plotinus. Aristotle goes way back up to the top. La Bruyere passes the seas and still maintains his reputation, but the glory of Malebranche is confined to his own nation and to his own age. Well, okay, how many of us have read either La Bruyere or Malebranche? I mean, I've read Malebranche, but not La Bruyere. And there's not a lot of people who do read Malebranche or La Bruyere today. But then the third one is very, very interesting. And Addison perhaps will be read with pleasure when Locke will be entirely forgotten. Then you might say, who's Addison? I've heard of John Locke. We read his second treatise on government. Maybe if we're in epistemology classes, we read his essay, this big thick book that was going to be a textbook. Maybe we read his remarks on education, or his thoughts on education, or other things like that, right? Addison? No. Now, Locke is one of those abstruse philosophers, as is Aristotle, whereas according to Hume, Cicero is one of the more popular philosophers, and so is Addison. Now, he does also say one other thing that I think is really worth bringing up. So he says, the mere philosopher is a character who is commonly but little acceptable in the world, being supposed to contribute nothing either to advantage or pleasure of society while he lives remote from communication with mankind and is wrapped up with principles and notions equally remote from their comprehension. Okay, so that's the accurate philosopher, the technical philosopher. On the other hand, the mere ignorant is still more despised, nor is anything deemed a surer sign of an illiberal genius in an age and nation where the sciences flourish than to be destitute of all relish for those noble entertainments. So you don't want an ignorant person. And he says the most perfect character is supposed to lie between these extremes, retaining an equal ability and taste for books, company, and business. So a kind of middle ground, right? Maybe between the easy and obvious and the accurate and abstruse, right? He says, in order to diffuse and cultivate so accomplish a character, nothing can be more useful than compositions of the easy style and manner, which draw not too much from life. So you do need to study this stuff over here, but this is where the real action is in philosophy. And then he's going to say, man is a reasonable being, and as such receives from science his proper food and nourishment, right? So that's speaking for the abstruse philosophy. But so narrow are the bonds of human understanding that little satisfaction can be hoped for in this. Man is a sociable, no less than reasonable being. Neither can he always enjoy company, agreeable and amusing, or preserve the proper relish for them. Man is also an active being, and from that disposition and from the various necessities of human life must submit to business and occupation. But the mind requires some relaxation and cannot always support its bent to care and industry. So Hume draws a conclusion from this. It seems then nature has pointed out a mixed kind of life as most suitable to the human race and secretly admonished them to allow none of these biases to draw too much. So, what does this apply to? He kind of talks about the extreme that he's tempted to. Indulge your passion for science, but let your science be human and have a direct reference to action and society. Abstruse thought, profound researches I prohibit and will severely punish by the pensive melancholy which they introduce, by the endless uncertainty in which they involve you, and the cold reception your pretended discoveries will meet when communicated. Be a philosopher, but amidst your philosophy, be still a man. So the mixed life is not perfectly poised between these two. It's actually more on the side of the easy and obvious philosophy. But that doesn't mean that we should just throw away accurate and abstruse philosophy. They both, as Hume says, have their function, their role for a proper and perfect character carrying out a mixed life in human company.